Okay, hello guys. This is our class 6 and 7 because I'm going to merge in this video chapter 6 and 7, and we are going to cover development strategies. So basically, we are going to focus on the element number 4 within IPE, which is economic development, and especially the strategies that the developing countries use in the 20th century. The chapter 6 and chapter 7 examine how political and economic forces have shaped the adoption and evolution of these new trade and development policies. And we are going to analyze and examine why governments in so many developing countries intervene deeply in their domestic economies, insulate them themselves from the international trade, and solve changes in international trade rules. So the first part of this video, we are going to cover the interest and institutional explanation for something that is called import substitution industrialization. So if you don't know what is import substitution industrialization, no worries, we're going to cover that concept in this video. So let's start recalling the Stopper-Samuelson theorem. So generally, developing countries are abundantly endowed with land and poorly endowed with capital. So if you recall the Stopper-Samuelson, you can answer these following questions. So agriculture is what type of sector? Manufacturing is what type of sector in the developing countries? And because of that, what about the position of the land owners and the owners of capital? So if you want, you could pause the video here, and we're going to discuss the answers in a few minutes. So, okay. Given that the developing countries are abundantly endowed with land, so that means that the developing countries have competitive advantages to produce those goods and services that need more labor. And given that developing countries are poorly endowed with capital, well, they are not going to be competitive to produce manufacturers. Why? Because manufacture goods require more levels of capital. So because of that, agriculture is the export-oriented sector. They are going to have competitive advantages. So their agricultural cost production is lower in comparison to the developed countries. So that's why they are going to export agriculture. And based on that, and given that they are poorly endowed with capital, where for the developing countries is preferable to import manufacturers from other countries that have more capital in comparison. So that's why manufacturing is the import competing sector. And because of that, the position of the landowners should be pro-free trade, because landowners will be the agricultural producers, and the owners of capital should be anti-free trade because they will face higher levels of competition and they do not have the same levels of competitiveness. So that's why they will be against of free trade. But we need that because what does the Stopper-Samuelson theorem mean in terms of the international market? And this is the most important question that we're going to cover in this week. So first, you have to understand that if we believe in the Ricardian model and the fractionary model and the factor model and so on and so forth, those models that we cover in the first week of this class, well, there should be a specialized world. So the global north, which are all the rich countries that are located in the north part of the world, well, they will produce manufacturers because they have more capital in comparison of land or labor. And the poor countries, which are the global south, which are all countries that are in the south part of the world, well, they should specialize in producing agricultural goods or commodity goods, and they will import manufactured goods from the global north. So this flow or this graph that you are seeing in the slide represents the international market flows. So the poor countries of the global south will produce agricultural goods, and they will export these commodity goods to the rich countries. The rich countries will buy these commodity goods, and they will produce manufactured goods, and these manufacturing goods will be exported to the poor countries, which is the global south. This is basically the main idea of our Ricardian model. But however, we're going to cover some key moments in the international market. So before 1930, or in fact, before the World Wars period, well, the international market established a free market economy with perfect specialization, in which the global north produce and specialize in manufacturing goods. They export manufactures and they import commodities, and the global south were perfectly specialized. They produce only commodities, and they export commodities and import manufacturers. However, what happened in the World Wars period? So we covered that in the previous classes, but the main implication of the this wars period was that the economy closed. In fact, for a cool knowledge that you could have, this is the first time where the economists known this concept, the idea of closed economy, because before 1930, the world was very open and highly specialized. However, in the World War I and World War II, and because of the war, the international market flows stopped, and we started to live in a closed economy, in this idea of autarky that we talk in the first week of this class. So what were the main implications? Well, the main implication was that the World War period stopped the specialized patterns in the international system. So rich countries of the global north were unable to produce manufactured goods. Why? Because they were in a war. So, and because of that, they couldn't produce, and the labor and the firms were completely destroyed by the war and the economic turmoil. Because of that, well, they couldn't produce normally, so the international flows stopped. So in a way, the global south tried to export their commodity goods. However, the exports couldn't reach the same levels as before 1930, but they required the manufactured goods, because the global south didn't produce these types of products given the specialized world. So based on that, global south saw an opportunity. And that opportunity was to create the manufacturing sector to produce these manufactured goods that were imported from the global north. So that's why this is called the import substitution industrialization. The import substitution industrialization we're going to define better, but basically the main idea of the import substitution industrialization is when a country is trying to produce domestically the imported goods. So and this was not a decision. It's more a necessity. Global South required these types of goods and services. They were demanding those types of goods and services, and they wanted to buy these types of goods and services. The problem was that there were not a supply of these types of services and goods. So that's why the import substitution industrialization is based on a replacement policy from imports. They required, needed, and wanted to produce this type of goods. However, there are more, the import substitution industrialization has an intellectual justification based on an structuralist argument. What is the main structuralist argument? Well, the structuralist argument is based on a belief. The belief it says that poverty resulted from too heavy concentration on agricultural production. So, according to the structuralist, well, countries are poor because they are only producing agricultural goods. And the main idea behind of this belief is because the human capital that is required to produce bananas, avocados, and so on and so forth is very low. And on the other side, the levels of investment that are needed to produce this type of agricultural goods are very low also. So in combination, well, countries are very poor because they don't have high skills to produce goods, and they don't require high levels of education, and they do not have infrastructure and investment, and the income that these countries could produce are very low. So this is a belief. So according to the structuralism, well, poor countries are poor because they are very specialized in agricultural products, and but the rich countries are rich because they could produce manufacturing goods. So in order to level up the conditions between these global South and global North countries, well, the global South should produce manufacturing goods. However, the basic problem that the structuralism device is that the shift of resources from agriculture to manufacturing will not occur unless the state, and we are going to highlight this part, the state adopted appropriate industrial policies. So it's not the market, and this is very important to you to keep in mind. So the solution that the structuralism is proposing is not based on the market reforms and market solution. It's more related to the idea that the state and the government is the only agent that is in charge of this possibility. And the other part of the structuralism argument is that there is a critical juncture. A critical juncture is an event that is exogenous. So the World War period create incentives to industrialize without competition. So this is not a decision that the poor countries made because they wanted to be industrialized. This was an opportunity. There was no competition. And this is very important because if you are a citizen from a global South country and you want to buy a manufactured good, and you have manufacturing goods that are produced abroad or domestically, it's very likely that the price of the domestic manufactured good in your country has a higher price than the same good that is produced in a global north. So your optimal decision is to buy the cheaper good. That doesn't mean that is the less quality. It's because, in fact, it could have higher quality because Global North has comparative advantages to produce this type of goods, manufacturing goods. So, but in this moment, there was no competition. So the World War period opened a window of an opportunity. And structuralism highlights this pattern. However, there are three main problems in the process of industrialization, according to the structuralism argument. The first one is the complementary demand. The second one is the external economies, and the third one is the decline of the terms of trade. So let's define the three problems and let's discuss what are the three problems of industrialization according to structuralism. So the first one is the complementary demand. So there is a fact. So the fact is that the global South economies were highly specialized in agriculture. So even when agriculture and manufacture are very interrelated, which according to those guys is the sectors are very they are complementary each other. Well, the problem is that no single firms had incentive to invest in industrialization because all the factors of production were used in the agricultural sector. And this is one thing. So no any single firm had incentive to invest in industrialization or to create manufactured goods because given that they were more competitive in the agricultural sector, well, they do not have incentive to move to another sector. The second part of this problem, according to the structuralism, is that an industry is not a firm. An industry is the agglomeration of firms. Therefore, we needed more than one firm investing to create an industry. So the structuralist data that uncoordinated market behavior will produce simultaneously investment in multiple manufacturing industries. So all the firms had more incentive to produce agricultural goods instead of manufacturing goods. And we require that every single firm move from the agriculture to the manufacturing, and they in a whole invest. So the problem here is that the market cannot provide this type of incentive to do that. The second problem is the pecuniary external economies. So as we already discussed, industries are very connected, intertwined. So I don't know, picture this. We have a steel industry and the car industry. So if we require, if we want to expand the car industry, well, the firms that are within the car industry require more steel. So they will require that the steel industry expand their production in the same way. So a steel industry needs the expansion of the auto industry, and auto industries need the expansion of the steel industries. However, as you can see, there is a coordination problem. Why? Because the owners of the steel plants will not increase the steel production unless they are sure that the car industry will increase car production in the same way, and vice versa. And again, as you can see, this is a market problem because unless investment decisions in the steel and car industries are coordinated, neither firm will invest to increase the amount it can produce. So structuralists argued that the way to overcome this coordination problem was with a state-led big push. So again, this is not a market reform, it's more a prerogative of the state to move the production factors from the agricultural sector to the manufacturing sector. The third problem, according to the structuralism, is related to the terms of trade. What is a terms of trade? Well, it relates the price of a country's export to the price of its imports. So basically is when you have, let me make an equation to, so the terms of trade, sorry, for instance, the terms of trade of, I don't know, computers, it's equal to price better if we change here for manufacturing products. So it's the price of the exports of manufacturers divided by the price of the imports of manufacturers. So as you can see, this is the way that economists define terms of trade. And if there is an improvement of the terms of trade, is because the price of the exports of these types of products are rising relative to the price of the imports of these types of products. So what is the meaning of that? That if the price of the exports is increasing and the price of the imports are decreasing, well, you have a higher income level. Why? Because the external income, or the income that is from the international market, is increasing because you are selling products at higher prices and you are buying products at lower prices. Or when there is a decline in the terms of trade is when the price of the exports are declining relative to the price of the imports, which means that the income that comes from the international market is reducing because the prices at which you are selling your products are reducing, and the prices that of the products that you are buying from the international market are increasing, so your income cannot buy more goods and services. So based on that definition, the problem was that when the World War started, well, there was a decline in the terms of trade for primary producers. So up to 1955, commodity prices fell by 5% and the industrial prices rose by 6%. So as you can see, we are here in the decline in the terms of trade. So the developing countries experimented a reduction of their external income, and some developing economists create this theory that is called Singer and Prebisch theory. So basically, what these two guys proposed was that the participation in the General Agreement of Trade and Tariffs will make it harder for developing countries to industrialize. Why? Because developing countries were forced not to protect their manufacturing sectors, while North countries could protect their agricultural sectors. And in 1964, developing countries tried to create a negotiation within the GATT or the GATT terms, and they created something that is called United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. And they tried to demand better terms and fair treatment in the international market. They wanted to have the same prerogatives than the global north to protect their weak sectors. However, that could not be possible. And that's why structuralism try to propose or give arguments to give the governments the possibility to transform the protectionist trade policies that benefit their principal political supporters into comprehensive state-led development strategies. However, as you can see, we have not defined yet what is an import substitution industrialization. So what is the import substitution industrialization? So import substitution industrialization is when you are industrializing your country by substituting domestically produced goods for manufactured items previously imported. So let's make an example. You are in your country and you are demanding cars. And you are from a developing country. So all the cars are, I don't know, produced in Germany. However, the World War began. So firms that produce cars in Germany couldn't produce more cars, but you need cars. So your country started to produce these cars to replace the imports with domestic products or domestic goods. So this is the import substitution industrialization. And the import substitution industrialization were implemented in two stages: the primary ISI and the secondary ISI. But what is the primary ISI? So when the World War II started, well, the main objective for the developing countries was to build an industrial sector to replace the manufactured goods and try to replace the imports from the global north. However, the problem here is that even when the import substitution industrialization was common in all regions around the world, and it was born as a characteristic of late industrialization because the World War broke the specialization patterns, well, the developing countries was unable to produce all types of manufacturing goods. Why? Because they required technology, higher levels of human capital, and higher levels of investment. And remember, before 1930, the developing countries were only producing agricultural goods. So they didn't have the technology, the investment, and the human capital required to produce the manufacturing goods. So that's why they wanted to produce only basic manufacturing goods, especially light and non-durable products, such as clothes, shoes, and so on and so forth. But this is what I'm going to say here is very important because before 1930, the developing countries were very specialized in the production of agricultural goods, and they were exporting commodities. However, we're going to divide the developing, the global south only into regions of the world: the Latin American countries and the East Asia countries. And as you can see, Latin American countries started to implement the ISI 30 years before than the East Asia countries. So Latin American countries started to implement the industrialization in 1930, whereas the East Asia began to implement these types of policies only around 1960. And why? Well, because this is something that we're going to cover later on, and this is something that is outside of the scope of the class, but basically it was because of the political context of East Asia and the invasion of Japan in the majority of these countries, and so on and so forth. And it was up to the end of the World War II that the majority of the East Asia countries could obtain again their independence. And because of that, until the end of the World War II, East Asia countries were able to implement autonomously these types of policies. However, in Latin American countries, they got their independence in the early 19th century. So that's why in 1930, they were able to implement this type of policies. However, the import substitution industrialization carried out a paradox. Why? Because they want to get more industry, but they had to get more imports. However, remember, they are trying to replace the imports from domestic goods. So despite the name import substitution, one result of the import substitution industrialization is increasing import volumes. Why? Well, because the global South countries needed to import intermediary goods and technology to industrialize their economies. So they didn't have the technology, the human capital, and the investment levels to produce manufacturing goods. So they required to import more, even when they were trying to block the import flows. So because of that, the import substitution industrialization becomes unaffordable because the demand for import exceeds foreign currency available to pay for imports. So what to do? What to do? You need to import more, but you want to block the international market. You need to import, but you have to pay in foreign currency, because remember the last classes, you cannot pay imports with your national currency. You have to buy foreign currency first and then buy the products that you want to import. And the problem was that if you are closing the international market, if you are closing the international flows of imports and exports, you are also closing the flows of foreign currency that could leverage or support the economic transactions. So what to do? So there are three possible responses to the rising cost of imports and the need for more imports in this situation. The first one is that you could attract more foreign capital, and we are going to cover the foreign capital in the next week. But basically, the foreign capital is could be or foreign aid or loans, and loans could be public and private. And you get the loan. You increase your level of debt, but you get the loan in foreign currency, and you pay the imports with the foreign capital that you get. The second one is try to increase exports. Why? Because if you are exporting more, well, you are receiving foreign currency. So you can produce more primary products or primary or commodities. You can export these commodities, and in exchange, you receive more foreign currency that could support your import consumption. However, that was a problem because they wanted to produce more commodity goods, but the global North was in a recession, so they couldn't. In 1930, and from 1930 to 1945, 1950, to buy the commodity goods. So that strategy was not a real option. So that could be our third possibility, which is the decreasing inputs. However, if we are going to decreasing imports because they are very cost, well, we're going to reduce industrialization, and this is not a possibility because at the end we have to, or we want to industrialize our country. So is it possible to reduce imports without restricting industrialization? And the answer is yes, to promoting something that is called backward linkages. And with upstream integration or vertical integration. So what is that? So let me explain that with an example. Imagine that we want to produce a bicycle, and the bicycle is formed by three main elements. The tires, the frame, and something that is called a speed rear, which is this part of your bicycle in which you can change the speed of your bicycle. And that's it. And we are going to organize or create a ranking in using the three elements of the bicycle. And we are going to put in the bottom the goods that have lower market power, and we are going to put in the upper part of the ranking the goods that have more market power. What is the market power? Well, the market power is when that type of good doesn't have or doesn't have competition, so they are very scarce, and they have higher levels of technology to be produced, and so on and so forth. So if the good have lower levels of competition, they require high levels of technology to be produced, and that good have more market power because the firms that could produce this type of products could, in a way, behave as a monopoly. They could decide the price of the product. However, if your product or the good has lower market power, that means that there are a lot of firms that are producing this type of goods, so they do not require high levels of technology to be produced, and their price is very low. So okay, why are we doing that? Because remember, we want to explain how is it possible to reduce imports without restricting industrialization, and with keeping in mind the structuralism ideas. So if we are only producing bicycles and we are in other developing countries and we want to produce all the bicycle, well, in theory, it was not possible because we didn't have the technology, the investment, and the human capital to do that. However, we could start producing only the bicycle tires. Why? Because these bicycle tires didn't require or don't require high levels of technology, high levels of investment, and high levels of human capital. So we could move or low-skilled labor to produce the tires. We can get a little bit investment, but not that the high amount of investment to produce the tires, and we can close the economy only in this segment. So we are only closing the bicycle tires. We still importing the frames and the speed rear, but we are only producing domestically the tires. There is something that is called horizontal market. So the skill required and the technology required to produce the tires could be extrapolated to produce other types of similar products. such as, I don't know, car tires or products from plastic and so on and so forth. So we are not only closing the market to produce bicycle tires, but we are in this moment able to produce similar products. So we are closing all the segment in the bottom level. This is the primary import substitution industrialization. What is the main goal in the long run? Because this is the short run strategy. So this is the present. So we don't have the technology, the human capital, and the investment. But we can only close one part, one segment of the market, and then in the future we can close the frame and all the similar products that could be produced with the same technology and the same skill in the labor. And then in the future, we can also close all the economy, all the market to produce the bicycle, all the bicycle domestically, but also all the similar products. So this is import substitution industrialization. And the primary import substitution industrialization is when you start only closing the products with lower levels of technology to train your industry, to give the opportunity to your industry to grow, because doing that in the future, your industry will be able to produce everything. So this is primary ISI. Develop domestic manufacturing of simple goods, such as soda, beer, apparel, shoes, furniture, bicycle tires. Training your industry in the short term to produce basic goods, to in the long run be able to produce everything. However, primary import substitution industrialization is also referred as easy industrialization. What do you mean by easy? Easy how? How it is easy? So it's easy in the way that there are large domestic demand pre-existing. So this type of basic products are demanding. So we count with the possibility to produce or these types of goods, to sell these goods into our domestic market. So we have the demand side of the market. Requires low tech, so which means require low levels of investment to produce that, and requires low skilled labor. So we can, in a way, move the labor that we are in this moment employing in the agricultural sector to produce this type of products. This is the primary ISI. Or there is something that is called secondary ISI. We are already explaining a little bit, but the secondary ISI, it's when the production of consumer durable goods, intermediate inputs, and the capital goods needed to produce consumer durables. So you are in this moment with the capacity and the investment and the human capital to produce products with higher levels of technology. You started by importing, for instance, car pieces and assembling them domestically, and gradually increasing the percentage of locally produced parts. So you are, as in our bicycle example, you are importing the frame, importing the speed rear, and you close the bottom. So you are producing the tires, and then 5 years later, you are only importing the speed rear, and you are producing the tires and the frame, and then 20 years later, you are able to produce all the parts of the bicycle. And there are three main instruments that the governments use to promote the secondary import substitution industrialization. The first one is the government planning. So why? Because the planning was used to determine which industries would be targeted for development and which would not. This is something that is not possible to close all the sectors, and you have to pick up the sectors that are more important and crucial for your economic development. The second instrument is the investment policy. Once you determine the targeted sectors, well, governments invested in these industries by creating, and this is very important, a state-owned enterprise. Because remember, the basic idea in the structuralism argument is that the state is the only actor that could move production factors from the agricultural sector to the manufacturing sector. So in that way, the government is creating a state-owned enterprise. And the third instrument is to impose trade barriers. Why? Because with trade barriers, such as tariffs, you are closing your economy and you are protecting your industry. So if one or of our citizens want to import some, I don't know, bicycle, well, we are going to increase the tariff that that person has to pay in order to import that product to disencourage him, and with the tariff, the import price should be higher than the domestic good or the domestic bicycle, and that person has more incentive to consume locally than from the international market. So so basically, the developing countries started the ISI in the same way. Even when the Latin American countries started 30 years before, they started the same way. Try to block the bottom part of the market, and with this vertical integration, try to train their industries to provide them more technology, to provide them to increase and enhance the human capital, and to increase the levels of investment. However, there was an divergence in 1960. In the 1960, Latin American countries decided to pursue the secondary ISI. And however, in the 1960, the East Asia country decided to pursue something that is called export-oriented industrialization, or primary export-oriented industrialization, that we are going to cover in a few minutes. This divergence is based on the structure of both economies. So let's try to talk a little bit more about that. What explains the divergence patterns in Latin America? Well, Latin America were very, very, very focused and specialized in the production of commodities, especially oil. So the majority of countries from Latin America could produce oil in that time, so they become very dependent on the exporting commodities. Before 1970, the oil had higher levels of higher price, higher prices. So that gave to the Latin American countries higher oil revenues. and because they could get higher levels of revenues from exporting oil, they could get higher levels of indebtedness. And given that they had the money and debt on the foreign capital, the foreign currency, to invest more and more in the locally domestic industry, well, they didn't want to open their industry to the international market. And that's why they had lower levels of integration with the international manufacturing sector by 1960. But there was another argument here, that was that the politicians using the protectionism to expand their political support. So the Latin American politicians used the ISI in order to get more expansionary policies to increase their political support, as we explained in the last class. But this is the main difference, because in the case of Asia, well, they didn't have the production of oil. So because of that, there was no loans. They couldn't increase the levels of debt, but they require more foreign capital to still increasing their investment in their industry. So because of that, because they couldn't pay the imports with oil exports, well, they had to be better in the production of the primary or the basic industrialized products that they produce with the primary industrialization stage, and they had to go to the international market and export this type of products. So this is the main divergence. So they, why? Because with these types of exports, they could generate more resources to pay the secondary ISI in new sectors such as heavy machinery, chemical products, and electronics. So that's why Latin American countries from 1960 to 1980, they tried to deepen the protectionism strategy, and East Asia, on the other hand, they wanted to, of course, enhance their industry, but through the international market, getting more competitiveness in the international market, and through exports of primary manufacturing goods. However, the basic idea of the ISI is to protect your market. And now, today, 2023, we know that the world is very globalized. So countries, in a way, do not use protectionism as a strategy. So we already know that the ISI didn't work. So why didn't the ISI work? So there are three reasons that we're going to cover. And the first reason is the current account. So the current account is well, the registers of a country imports and exports. And when you have a deficit in your current account, it's because you are importing more than you are exporting. And the ISI led to countries to have deficits in their current account because the manufactured goods were not globally competitive, only sold domestically. So, and this is the case of Latin America. So their products were no good. The quality were so low. And one of the reasons was the protectionism, because if you want to produce more competitive, you have to get more competition. but your economy is closed. So you are not creating incentive to your firms to produce with lower cost. This is one reason. The second reason is because when you are in a closed economy, you are not able to import technology. And if you are not able to import technology, well, your firms do not have the possibility to produce with lower cost. So at the end, that prices are not competitive. And this is one risk. So you are importing more because you are trying to compensate the lack of competitiveness in your economy. The second reason is because the market at the end weakened the agricultural sector, and firms in the agricultural sector started to believe that they didn't want to produce and to be productive, because if all the benefits are in the manufacturing sector because they are protected, well, you decided to not produce more in the agricultural sector. And you, as a country in a developing world, or especially in Latin America, well, given that they were very dependent on the oil, so they require that the agricultural sector and the commodity sector were producing in the top level. However, there was a perverse incentives to move to the industry sector and to leave out the agricultural sector. And the third argument is that the government preferred overvalued exchange rates. And this is very sad because that contributed to making export less competitive, as we explained in the last class. So this is one of the reasons. The second reason is the oil crisis and the debt crash. What is the oil crisis? Well, in the 1970s, there was an oil crash, primarily triggered by geopolitical events. And that the main consequences was the oil embargo imposed by the Organization of Iron Petroleum Exporting Countries, and that caused an oil price shock. So the embargo caused the sharp increases in the oil prices, leading to a significant rise in import costs for oil-dependent countries worldwide, especially in Latin America. Given that there was a huge increase in the oil prices, the interest rate in the international market also rose in higher levels. And remember, Latin American countries were heavily relying on oil imports, and they were heavily in debt. And because of that, there was a huge levels of debt accumulation, and the combination of increased debt burdens, inflation, and the reduction of economic growth shock the region and every single country in Latin America in the 1980s went to a recession. So this is the debt crisis. So the Latin American countries, such as Mexico, Brazil, and Argentina, accumulated significant external debt during the 70s to cope with the oil crisis and finance development projects. In the early 80s, the global economic conditions shifted, and the cost of the serving the debt went to the skyrocket. So many of Latin American countries face difficulties in repaying their debts, and the access to the international capital markets were close to the Latin American countries, and that produces the high levels of indebtedness, and all the Latin American countries went to economic recessions. And because of that, the protectionism as a strategy started to crack. And in the 80s, and this is more in at the beginning of the 90s, the world started to implement new liberal policies, more aligned to the idea to restrict the size of the government, to restrict the prerogatives to intervene the economy, and to impose a free market conditions. And that was what happened. So LATAM had to negotiate a structural adjustment with the IMF, the International Monetary Fund. Why? Because they were in a bankrupt. So, and the IMF is a development bank. It's not a commercial bank. It's not Chase Bank or Citibank and so on and so forth. The main difference between the IMF and the one commercial bank is that the IMF lent money to countries. This is the main difference. So you cannot have a saving account or you cannot have a saving account in the IMF. And a country such as, I don't know, Nigeria cannot have a saving accounts in Chase Bank, right? So this is the basic difference between the development bank and commercial bank. And given that the developing countries in Latin America were not bankrupt, well, they had to renegotiate their loans with the IMF. And however, the IMF trying to expand these neoliberal ideas of the free market and so on and so forth, well, they propose to the Latin American countries to implement economic reforms in exchange of better loans and the reduction of the interest rates. So, and this is something that is called Washington Consensus that we are going to cover in the last class in the last week of this class. But basically, the economics reforms were three. The first one was that the governments needed to take a smaller role in policy areas where markets work well. So the IMF tried to ensure that the governments were not able to intervene in the economies. And because of that, the IMF wanted to pursue a stable macroeconomic environment. And how? How? In what ways? To cut the demand, to cut and to reduce the government deficits, and to let to the market to assign efficiently the resources, and to cut the incentive to politicians to use the fiscal and monetary policies to only get political support instead of reaching economic objectives. The second most important reform was to liberalize trade, to eliminate the possibility of protectionism. And the third one was the privatize the state-owned enterprise. So to give these industries that were created by public resources to the private sector and to the market to assign and to control and so on and so forth, the production factors that these enterprises were using. The East Asia, on the other hand, well, they didn't have to get IMF structural or adjustment. Why? Well, because the decision to export-oriented strategy in 1960 was a success. In fact, given the high levels of competition that they faced in 1860, provide them to the possibility to produce with higher levels, with lower levels of cost and with high levels of competitiveness. So the state where the Asian state was very, very strong and very successful in mobilize the resources from the agricultural sector to the industrial sector and to create better industrial policies to support their industrialization process. And because they were not producing oil and they were not dependent on the oil revenues, well, the oil crisis in 1970s didn't affect them, and they could get low inflation. They increasing the levels of savings, and they use the monetary policy wisely to promote exports, but to prevent to the government to get high levels of debt. And that's why they were very successful. And when we depict the evolution of the GDP per capita between Latam and East Asia, we can see that in 1960, a citizen from Latin America were almost double or get almost the double income from any citizen from East Asia. And in 60 years, East Asia GDP per capita is higher, very, very higher. And it's almost the double of the GDP per capita from any single person in Latin America, but it goes more than that. They have reached high levels of investment in human capital and development. So, okay, guys, this is our end of our week. So let's see you in the next week with the explanation of foreign investment. So again, if you have any questions or comments, please send it to me, to my email, and I will be very glad to reply to your concerns and to your questions. So see you.